Know some JavaScript? Let's turn it into a simple cookie clicker game. You will learn the basics of HTML and how to connect HTML with JavaScript that they can work together. I have an empty project in Visual Studio Code. Let's start from the creating index.html file. Index.html is the name convention for the homepage of your web project. So if you have several HTML files, the main one is called index.html. Let's type something, for example, hello world. Then I save this file and I use live server extension to run this file in the browser. I click go live. And now in the browser, I see hello world. If your text is too small, you can click this zoom button and here you can change the zoom of this page. So we can type a text in our HTML file and it will be visible in our browser. But we have one problem. We can't control this text. So for example, on the second line, I add a new sentence. Then I save this file and refresh the browser. And now we see that even though that I wrote it on a new line, in the browser it is still on one line. And to control the text that we type in HTML files, we have tags. Let's close this Explorer. I just click Explorer icon. And now on a new line, I type P. Then I see a list of different options and I press enter to choose the first tag. And now you see two elements, the opening tag and the closing tag. And between them, we can add our text. And then if I save this file and refresh the page, we will see this sentence on a new line. You also have other tags for a text. For example, you can press H. From H1 to H6 are different header tags. The difference between them in the size of the text. So for example, I choose H1 and if I save this file, you see that the sentence, my header, is much bigger than other sentences. So now you know the basics of HTML. Let's start the creation of our project. For that, I delete all the content on this page. Then I type an exclamation mark. And now I see the first option, so I press enter. And now you see the basic structure of an HTML file. Let's save it and refresh the page. And now you see that our page is blank. And this is because all the elements that we see on our page should be inside body tag. All other lines that we see, they are just configuration of this file. For example, doctype.html defines the rule of HTML file. Then we have HTML tag where the language is defined. In our case, this is English. And then we have a head block. Here are different metadata that is used for accessibility and SEO, and then we have a title. This is a title for our project. Let's change it to cookie clicker. And now if I save this file, you can see that in the top of our browser, we see the name of our file, which is cookie clicker. But let's add some elements on this page. So we want to add a counter. For that we use p tag. I press P, then enter. And I also type count 0 because we start from the counter of 0. And the second element that we have in our game is a picture of a cookie. For that we have a separate tag image. I type img and then press enter. And now I can display the image on our website. But we actually need to have this image on our computer. So you can download it from my GitHub. For that, you can click on the first link in the description and then you will see this page. These are files from the video. So to download the image, click image, then cookie PNG, and now click download raw file. Now you need to create the same folder in this project. So I click new folder and I type image. Now I click on this folder and here I paste the image of the cookie. So I choose this image and then I just drag and drop it. And now in our folder, you see that we have cookie.png image. Make sure that this is inside of this folder. If you close it, you don't see cookie.png file anymore. So let's open it back. And I can close the cookie.png image here. Now in the source, I type image, then slash, and cookie.png. Now if I save this file, I will see an image of a cookie. We also should provide alternative attribute, and this is just a text that will be displayed if our program can't find the image. We can type something like cookie image. And for example, if I change this path, so I add 1 in the end and save this file, now you see this message cookie image instead of the picture. Let's return it back. And let's change the size of this image. For that, I can add a new attribute width. After the image tag and before the source attribute, I type width. And I can type something like 100 pixels. If I save it, we have a small image. And now I can zoom this page. So now we see both the image and the counter. And when we click our image, we want to increase our counter. So for that, we use JavaScript file. Let's open the Explorer and create a new JavaScript file. I call it script.js. Now we have two separate files, so we need to connect them together. For that, in the index.html file, in the head, right after our title, I press enter and type script column source. Now I can press enter. And here we can reference to our JavaScript file. So I type the name of the JavaScript file, script.js. Now our files are connected, we can start writing the JavaScript file. The first thing that we will do in our script.js file is the copy of the counter. Generally, we don't want to take the counter from the HTML, increase it, and set it back. We want to have a separate element that is responsible for the math in JavaScript, and then if I increase this counter, I want to change this text as well. And then I increase the counter again, and I change the HTML file again. So let's write a script that will do this work for us. I return back to 0. So we know that we can increase our counter, for example, by typing count++. This line will increase our counter by 1, but we also need to set the counter in the HTML file. For that, we need to access this element in the JavaScript. In the JavaScript, we have a method getElementById that returns the HTML element or null. We pass the ID to this method, and if this ID doesn't exist in our HTML file, countElement variable equals to null. But if it exists, we access our HTML element and we can change its properties. Currently, we don't have this ID in our index.html file, so let's add this attribute to our p tag. Right after p, I type ID and press enter. And now I need to pass the name of this ID. In our case, this is count. And now I can save this file. Now in the JavaScript, we have this element and we can change this text property. CountElement has a text content property. This is the text that you see right here, and we can set it to another value, for example, to count. But currently, if you save this file, you will not see any changes. So let's inspect this page. Do right click, then find inspect property, and now open the console. You will see the error that null element doesn't have the text content property. If you hover over count element, you will see that it can be equal to HTML element or null. And it is equal to null only if we don't have this ID in our HTML file. But we have this ID. What is the problem? This is a very common problem that HTML file reads the code line by line. And when it reaches the script line, it executes our JavaScript file. And at this point, we haven't initialized our body yet. So it means that we don't have all these elements. And this is the reason why our count element equal to null. We actually want to initialize all the HTML file before the JavaScript file. And for that, we have an attribute defer that we can put after the source attribute. Now I save this file and you see that our error is gone. And if you look at our page, you will see 1 instead of count column 0. So let's add count column in our JavaScript file as well. And now if I save this file, you see that our count is equal to 1. We want to change the count only when a user clicks on a cookie. For that, we need to track the state of the cookie. When a user clicks, he changes the state of this element. And on this change, we can increase our counter by 1. So let's do it step by step. First of all, we need to access the image element in the JavaScript file. For that, I will use getElementById method. I use the ID cookie, so let's add this ID to our image tag. Right after this tag, I add ID. Then I save this file. Now I wrote a large line. Cookie element has a method addEventListener, and this is a complicated method that can track the state of our element. Generally, we provide two parameters. The first parameter is what we are controlling. We are controlling the click of the user. So when this element is clicked, then we execute the second parameter. In our case, the second parameter changes the text content of the count element to a new count that we calculate in this file. If you remove the first property and add quotes, you will see all other options that we can control. I choose the click option. And when I save it, I see that our counter is equal to 1. And if we click our cookie, we don't see any changes. This is because when we provide our second parameter without wrapping it into a function, we immediately execute it. So let's wrap our parameter into a function. Now we increase our counter inside of this function, and then we set our text element to a new counter. When I save this file, you see that our counter is equal to 0. And if I click our cookie, we see that our counter is changing. Here is also one important detail. If you refer to your function, like here we have increase count name, so this is the name of our function, I don't use parentheses. If I type this parenthesis, it means that I immediately want to execute this function. So if I save this file, you will again see that our counter equal to 1. If I click the cookie, nothing changed. This small detail is very important because when you don't add this parenthesis, you refer to your function, and addEventListener function can automatically call it if a user clicks on the element. So I can click cookie and my count will be incremented. But this game is very plain, so we don't have any styles. Actually, to change the styles of this game, we will use a CSS file. First of all, open the folder where your project is located, and here create a new file. I click new file icon, then type style.css. Now I can hide the Explorer. And this is a plain CSS file. So now we need to connect it to our HTML. For that, in the head, right after the title, I can write link column CSS. Then press enter. It creates a link to your CSS file with all the necessary fields. Now I can just save this file. Now I go to our CSS file, and now we can try to change something. I've changed the background of our game, so I'm sure that this file is connected correctly. So this is the basic structure of CSS. We always use a selector, which is generally a tag from our HTML file. So as you see, we have a body tag that contains all the visible elements on our page, and I use this tag to apply the property of background color. And then the value of this property is gray. As you see, we have a lot of text that explains what it does. For example, I also want to change the font color. For that, I have a color property. I type color, then press enter, and now I see the list of all options for the color. I type white. If I save this file, you see that currently our font is white. These properties are applied to the body tag. But if you look at our HTML, you will see that actually body tag doesn't have any text. It has another tag B that contains the text count column 0. And this text also have been changed even though that we haven't applied any properties directly to the B tag. When we don't specify any direct properties for the p tag, it tries to inherit the properties from the parent elements. In this case, the parent element is body. So for example, if I add the tag p, and if I change this color to another one, now we see that the text is green. And this is because we directly specified the property for the p tag. Also, I see that we have one property width that is equal to 100 pixels in the HTML. But generally, we write such properties in CSS file. So let's delete it from the HTML. And now let's apply it to CSS. So I add a new tag image. And here I change the width to 100 pixels. And now we see absolutely the same result. Actually, my elements are very small. So currently I have the zoom of 500. If you click the zoom button, you can see that my current zoom is 500. So let's reset it. And now let's change the sizes that we don't need to zoom this page. So for example, the image size can be 250 pixels. And now let's change the font size. Inside of the p tag, I type font, and now you see the list of different properties that the font has. The first property after the font is font size. And here I can use the default values like large, medium, small, or I can type pixels. For example, I put 50 pixels. I save this file, and now we see that our font is much bigger. Let's try 100 pixels. I also don't like this color, so let's delete green color. So now I like the size of our font. But if you Google for any CSS code, probably you will see rems instead of pixels. Rems are also the static units, so one rem is the same as 60 pixels. But I return back 100 pixels. Then let's look at other font properties. I type font again, and right after the size, I see font family property. And here I have different font family options. For example, I can choose Arial, and now you see that our font family have been changed. Currently, the Arial font family is applied, but you see that we have provided 3 different options. If the Arial option is incompatible with the user's browser, it will try to use Helvetica. If this font size is also incompatible, it will use the last option. And if all these font family options are incompatible, it will use the default option that any browser has. So when we don't provide any font family, we also see the default option of the Google Chrome. The next property is font weight. And here you see different numerical options, as well as bold, lighter, or normal. So by default, normal is applied. So it doesn't change anything. But for example, I can use bold. And now you see that my font weight is much bolder. And actually not all the options will change something. So for example, if I put bolder, we will not see any changes. And this is because Arial doesn't have bolder font weight. All these options depends on the font weights that a specific font family has. I know that Arial has only 3 different options. So this is the reason why I can use bold, lighter, or normal. But if a font family has more options, you can use these numerical options where 100 is the lighter option and 800 is the most bold option that this font family has. So in this way, you can discover different options. So you just type something like font, and then you see a list of filtered options by the popularity. The font size is the most popular option that we change. Then we change font family, font weight, font style, and so on. So you can discover different options to see what you can change. Now let's talk about positions of the elements. Currently, the position is in the top left corner, but for example, we want to change it to the middle. So the simplest option is to use margin. So I have margin property, then I press enter. And here I can type the value in pixels or rems. For example, I type 100 pixels. And now you see that our text have been shifted to the right side. So for example, I type 300 pixels. And currently we see that our text is almost in the middle. So margin actually adds an invisible border. If you inspect the page by right click, then choose the inspect property. Here you can inspect different options. So you can choose elements and I can hover over P and now you see this orange border. If I choose computed option, you will see that this is the margin of 300 pixels. And now you see that actually we have created this invisible border around the P tag. So and this is the reason why the position have been shifted. Let's also add something to our cookie. I will also add margin of 300 pixels. And now we see that our cookie in the bottom of this page and our elements are very far away from each other. So actually I want to apply margin only to the body tag. I don't want to add margin inside of the P tag or image tags. So I delete the current margin. Now we see that our elements are close to each other. And now inside of the body tag, I add margin of 300 pixels. And now we see that our elements are around the middle of the screen. Now, if you look at body tag, you can see that we have this orange border around our elements. And you see that actually margin property applies the border from all the sides. But what you can do in CSS, for example, instead of the margin property, you can choose margin top, bottom, left, or right. It will add the border only to one side. So for example, I can choose margin left property, and now I will write 300 pixels. And now you see that our elements have been shifted from the left side, but it is still very close to the top of this page. And now if I want to move it from the top of this page, I can separately set the margin of the top. So for example, I put minus 100 pixels. And now you see that our elements have been shifted up because we used negative value. How to change the position of elements using the display flags property. We will also add an animation to the cookie when we click it. If you inspect the page by right click and inspect, you will see that our elements are not centered. And this is because we used fixed pixels to change the position of our elements. So let's delete margin left and margin top. Now we see that our elements in the beginning of the page. Also, if you hover over HTML tag, you will see that our page is only 600 pixels. So I click HTML and now I can hover over blue rectangle and I see the sizes of our page. I want the page with the same size as the user's screen size. For that, I will add HTML tag and here I define height property. In this case, I use 100 view height units. View height units are the dynamic units that depends on the height. We also have view width units. And in this case, our height will be the 100% of our width. So if I hover over this blue rectangle, I see that the width and the height are the same. But I want to use view height units. And in this case, I see that the height of our page is the same as the screen size. We can change the screen size and I see that this number changes automatically. Now I will show you how to center our objects. If I hover over body, I see that it also takes only some part of the screen, but I want our body to be with the same height as our HTML page. At first, I add the same property to our body, and now I will write the combination of properties that center our objects. Now we see that our objects are centered on this page, but you see that the alignment is different. By default, our elements are aligned in the same way as they are written in the HTML. So we have P, then image, and the default alignment is P tag with the content of count, and then we have the image. But if I use the display flags property, it changes the default alignment to the row, and I can change it with flags direction property. Now my flex direction is equal to column, and you see that our elements aligned in one column. Now let's talk a bit about justified content. This property changes the position of elements depending on the flex direction. If the flex direction is column, it changes the direction on the column. Currently it is center, but for example, I can set flex start. Now you see that the position of our elements have been changed to the beginning of the column. The same will happen if I use flex end. But I will choose flex start. Now about align items. This property changes the direction along the cross axis. So cross axes are the opposite from our flex direction. If our flex direction is column, align items changes the direction along the row. So for example, I will use flex start. And now you see that along the row, our elements have been changed to the start of the screen. So the same if I use flex end, but I want to center. If you want to learn more about this powerful tool, back when I was learning, the Flexbox Froggy game helped me a lot. Here you can read the description of different properties, and then you need to write the code that moves the froggy to the lily pad. So for example here, we need to write justify content flex end. And now we see that our froggy is on the lily pad. And in the same way, you can learn about other properties of the display flags. We also want to add a small animation to our cookie when we click it. Currently, if we click, only the count will be incremented. So at first, I think that we need to increase the width of our image. So for example, let's put 350 pixels. And actually the topic of animations in CSS is advanced. But I found the way how to easily explain you a very simple animation. Each element on our page has several states. For example, image has the default state and the active state. When I click on the image, I change the state to the active. I can click and then I grab this image, and while I grab this image, the state of this image is active. What we want to do is actually to change the size of the image when it is in the active state. Right after the image, let's add a new selector. To change the properties of the active state, I add column active to my tag. So this is a complicated selector that activates some style properties only when our image is in the active state. And for example, let's change the width to 330 pixels. And now let's try to click. So you see that we have this simple animation, and while I'm holding the image, the size of this image is 330 pixels. I see that it changes relative to the top of the image, but I want to change this animation relative to the center of this image. A very simple solution is to add a margin to the top. For example, I add 10 pixels. And now we see that our animation is relative to the center, but I still think that this is too plain. So let's rotate this image a bit. So deg means degrees and -2 means to change the rotation to the left by 2 degrees. And now if I click, you see that we have a very interesting and simple animation. But this is not the proper way how we should write animations in CSS. So the proper way of the same animation is much more complex, but I think that currently you can understand what it means. So if I click the cookie, we have almost the same animation, but this is a bit smoother. You see that we have the same image active tag that changes the scale to 92%. So we decrease the scale by 8% and we rotate the image by 2 degrees. And then we have additional transition property in the image that adds a smooth transition that lasts 0.5 seconds. Let's also remove the scrolling bar. In the HTML tag, I can add scroll bar width property with non-value. And now we see that we don't have any scroll bar, but we still can scroll it a bit. Also, when you click the cookie a lot, at some point you can hold this image. I want to remove this property, and the easiest way how to do it is actually to go to the HTML. And here I pressed Alt-Z to wrap the file. And now in the image tag, right after the ID, I can add draggable false. And now if I save this file, I hold this image, but I don't see the picture of this image. Let's also change the background of this page. Currently our background is gray. I want to add this custom color, you can hover over this square and here you can change the color and then the code will be updated automatically. If I save the file, you see that we have another color, but I like this dark blue color. The same with the font color. I want to change it to a bit darker white color. Again, you can hover over it and change as you like. In today's video, you will add the feature that increase the clicking power. You can click the cookie, and if you have enough count, you can buy an upgrade. And now your clicking power is 2. So each time when I click cookie, it adds the count of 2. And we need to add buttons for increase click power and increase autoclick power. It seems that we need to add only 2 buttons, but actually each text that you see is a separate HTML element. Let's start from the adding buttons. So currently in my HTML file, we have only p tag for the count and the image tag. Now I will add a button tag. Now you see that we have 2 buttons and they already have some default styles. The first problem that we have that we want to change the alignment of these buttons. If you look at our CSS file, you will see that currently our body has the display of flags with the flex direction of column. This is important to understand that our body is all the page that we see and all elements that are inside the body will have the alignment of column. But we want to add both buttons on the same level. So how to do it? These are the elements that we have in our HTML and we need to group them in order to change the alignment. All this page is our body and the body should see only 3 elements. So we have to group last 2 elements in order to change their alignment. So if we inspect this page by right click, then inspect, this is the HTML code for this project. So inside of the body, we have only 3 elements. Our p tag for count, our cookie image, and the section for our buttons. So when the body tag adjusts the position of elements, it adjusts only the position of these 3 elements. And then inside of the section, we can put our buttons and change the position of these buttons. To make a group of elements, I have to add a section tag. Now inside of the body, we have only 3 elements. We have our p tag, then our image, and then our section. And now when I save this file, you see that the position of our elements have been changed. Currently, the default position for buttons suits very well, but let's clearly define the right position. So in the CSS file, right after all this code, we will write the CSS in a slightly different way. All this code that we have in the CSS applied directly to HTML tags, body tag, p tag, or image tag. But if we have a lot of elements on our page, it is very difficult to manage styles. And for that, you use classes. Generally, we apply most of our styles to classes. For that, in the HTML, I add a new attribute class. In this section, I will write class, then press enter. And now I can give the name for this section. For example, I can call it shop. Then I save this file and now I can change our styles. To access a specific style, we need to put a dot and then to write the name of the class. So in our case, this is shop. And now I can apply style properties. We want to apply display flex with the flex direction of raw. So now we explicitly defined the alignment for these elements, and if we add more elements, it will not break the alignment. Now let's add all the remaining elements. We should add all these p tags with the specific text. So in our HTML, we should add the text for our current click power. And let's also add the text for our autoclick power. Now we see that our font is too big, and this is because we applied the font size of 100 pixels directly to all p tags. I don't want to change our previously written CSS, but let's change the font size of these 2 elements. this selector applies only to p tags that are inside of the shop class. If you hover over this selector, you will see that no matter which HTML element that has the class of shop and that has p tags inside will have these styles. And you see that the font size of our text have been changed. Let's also change the font weight. And now again we have the same problem that we want to align these elements in the column. So they should be above our button. All these elements have the alignment of column. Currently we have 3 groups of elements. Now in the last group we have elements that should be aligned in the row. And then these 2 elements should be aligned in the column. The same with these 2 elements. It means that we need to create 2 additional groups. And now you see that they have the right alignment, but again, we can define the explicit alignment of these elements. For that, I need to give a class for each section. So I will give the same class for them. And both these classes will share the same styles. So I added the display of flex with the flex direction of column, and now you see that we have the right alignment. For the last text elements, we don't need to create a new section, we can add them inside of the button element. In this case, we will need to write less CSS code, but it is also possible to group them with the section element, but I think that this is a slightly more complex way. Inside of our button, I delete the text, I expand this tag, and now I will add p tags with the same text as we have on this page. So now we have the text inside of our first button. Let's do the same with the second button. Now we have all the HTML elements that we need. Now let's style these elements in the same way. If you inspect this page, you will see that all these p tags has the default margin of 60 pixels. So let's remove it. I want to remove this margin only for p tags that are inside of our shop class. Now I put margin 0, but I want to add the additional space inside of these buttons. So let's choose the button tag. Again, we choose only buttons which are inside the shop class. And now I can add additional padding. Also, I want to increase the size of this button. And now I want to align our text to the left side. For that, we have a shorthand text align. So we don't need to provide the display flex property. And I also think that these buttons are too close to each other. So I want to add additional margin. But if I use the common margin property, I don't like the position of our button's title. So we want to create only this space between 2 buttons. And for that, I can use margin left. Or it is better to use margin right. So now I like the position of our buttons, but let's change the background color of these buttons. Now our buttons are too dark, so I will change the color of our font. And also I want to change the border. You can use another color. So for example, instead of this border color, you can write blue color. And then you will see the square. And if you change this color, you can see RGB color, or you can click on this header and then it will be changed to a hexadecimal code. So you can use whatever colors you like. I just like to use very specific colors, and this is the reason why I use hexadecimal code. I return back the color for our border, and I also can round our borders. And for that, I have the property of border radius. In our final version, you also can see that I have the animation when I hover over the button. Let's add the same animation. For that, I need to use a complex selector, which is very similar to this selector that we used for our cookie. This is called pseudo selector. And now instead of the active selector, I use hover selector. It triggers the body when we hover over our buttons. And now you see that the color of our border becomes a bit lighter. Also, I want to slightly increase the size of the button. For that, I can use the scale property of 1.01. So it means that we increase the scale of our button in 1%. And now if I hover over our button, you see a nice little animation. In our image, we used an active selector, which triggers the body if we click on the element. But for the animation for our buttons, we use the hover selector, and it triggers the body if we hover over the button. When I click this button, we don't have any animation, but you can add additional animation when you click on the button, and for that you need to write a new complex selector with the active selector. So something like that. You can change the color to red, and when you hover over, you see that your border becomes a bit lighter, but if you click this button, you see that the border changes to the red. But I don't like the styles for this project. I delete the active state. We also see that the color of the text in the button is different. So for that, let's add new classes for each p tag. So in our HTML, for our cost, let's add a new class cost. And for our description, I add a new class description. And the same classes I will add for our Autoclick button. And now in the CSS, let's change the colors of these buttons. And for our cost, I can use the built-in gold color. And for our description, I can use the same color as for the borders. Actually, I think that our text is too close to each other, so I want to increase margin a bit. Here, when we changed the margin of our p tags, I will add a small margin of 4 pixels. And now if I compare it with the result, I see that this shop section has additional space between the cookie image. Let's add this additional space. Inside of the shop tag, I will add margin top of 52 pixels. And now you see that our styles are absolutely the same as in the result. So now we can click our cookie and we can click our button, but it doesn't do anything. So let's define the behavior of our buttons in the JavaScript file. Let's go to our JavaScript file, and here we have the code that increases the count when we click our image. So let's separate them with the comments. Now we can write the code for our click power button. The structure will be the same. As you remember, we should initialize variables in the JavaScript, and then we need to change the HTML based on these variables. So for our cookie, we initialized the count, then we accessed two elements, count and the cookie, from the HTML file. Then we wrote a function that increases the count, and then we wrote the trigger when this function must be executed. These are 4 basic steps that we need to do. So let's start from the variables. Which numbers we want to change on this page? The current click power shows the current power of our click, and we want to change this number. The same with Autoclick power. Also, we want to increase the cost every time when user upgrade his power to increase the difficulty. So let's add these variables into JavaScript. For these variables, I use the keyword let because I need to change these variables later. Now let's access the elements that we want to change in the HTML. For that, I will use the same document getElementById function. But to access elements by ID, we need to add these IDs in our HTML file. I want to access current click power tag, current Autoclick power tag, costs, and also buttons. So in the HTML file, let's add ID to all these elements. So this is our current click power, and I add the attribute ID, which is generally the first attribute after our text name. And also you might have a question why I separate words with uppercase. For IDs, I use camel case if I want to use these IDs in JavaScript. So this is the convention. For classes, I used keybub case that separate words with a hyphen because this is the convention for CSS. But if I want to use the same IDs in the CSS, in this case, it is better to use keybub case for the consistency. In this project, I use IDs only in the JavaScript file, so I use the camel case. I also added the ID for our click cost, and here is one important moment that all IDs should be unique. So if you add an ID, be sure that this ID is unique. So this is the reason why I can't use the name cost for our ID, because in this case I can't recognize the click power button cost and autoclick power button cost. And also I want to add IDs for our buttons. Totally I added 6 different IDs. And now we can access these elements in our JavaScript. I added first 3 elements from our click power button. Be sure that the IDs that you write in the getElementById function matches the IDs that you set in your HTML file. Now I added all these elements to our JavaScript file, and I found that in index.html I wrote autoclick buttons ID, but I want to change it to autoclick button. So be careful when you name your IDs. In the next step, I want to write a function that will define the behavior for our buttons. First of all, let's think of what we want to add to this function. So first of all, because our button has a specific cost, we need to validate if the user has enough cookies. The second step is to update all the variables that we have in JavaScript. And then we need to update the corresponding HTML elements. So now you see the steps. Try to write this function yourself. But now let's write it together. For the validation, we can use if statement. And we need to check that if the count is more or equal to the click cost. If the user has enough cookies, we can update our GS variables. So we need to update the count, the price, and the current click power. A new count is equal to count minus click cost. And for that, we have a shorthand count minus equal click cost. So we just subtract the cost from the total count. Then we can increase the click power by 1. And then I update our click cost, and for that I use the multiplier of 1.4. The initial click cost is 10, and then we multiply 10 by 1.4, so the next click cost is 14. If you want to increase the difficulty, you can change this multiplier, for example, to 1.6. Or if you want to decrease the difficulty, you can decrease this multiplier. I want to use 1.4. You also can create a new variable multiplier where you will store this value, especially if you want to use it for the autoclick cost power. But I want to use 2 different multipliers, and just for the simplicity, I would hardcode this value to 1.4. Now let's update the HTML elements. For the count, I have the count element from the beginning. And then we change the text content of these elements. And here we have the static part of count plus our variable. And eventually this line will be count 1, count 2, and so on. Then I want to change the click power title. The static part will be current click power, and the dynamical part will be the click power variables that we have in our JavaScript. And in the same way, we change the cost element. So now our function is finished, and the last step is to write the trigger when this function must be executed. So we want to execute this function when we click our button. So our button needs the trigger, and for that we will use add event listener function, where we define the trigger when it is executed. So in our case this is clicked, and then we pass the function's name without the parenthesis. So if you add parenthesis to the function's name, it is executed immediately. So I use click button element. Here I add event listener. Our target is click, and the function that we must execute is increase click power. So now we can test our game. So the initial power is 1. So when I click the cookie, it increased by 1. Now my count is 10 and I want to buy the upgrade. So now I have the click power of 2, the count of 0 and the cost of 14. But if I click the cookie, the count still grows by 1. The mistake that we have in our project is related to our previous code. So in our cookie and count part, if we look at the increase count function, we can see that we actually increase the count by 1. But we want to increase our count by the click power. So let's change this line to count plus equal click power. Now I test this game again. I have the count of 10. I can upgrade our click power. And now when I click my cookie, the count grows by 2. Now my count is 14. I can buy a new cost. Now you see that our cost has a lot of decimal numbers. Let's round the cost to the integer. For that, in our increase click power function, we can add the math.round function. So this function rounds our number to the integer using the mathematical rules. And now if I test our game again, it works correctly. We already have added the click power upgrade button, and now we can earn cookies and buy upgrades to increase the click power. Let's implement the Autoclick power button. In our JavaScript file, we have several sections. The first section is responsible for cookie and count. The second section is responsible for click power button. In the end of this code, let's add a new section that is responsible for the Autoclick power button. And we will build it in the same pattern as we built our click power button. So we have variables for JavaScript, then we access the HTML elements, then we have functions, and then we have triggers. The first thing is that I already have added the variables and HTML elements for the Autoclick button. Let's bring all these elements into a new section. So now we have two variables that are responsible for the Autoclick, and we have 3 HTML elements that we will change. So now we need to write the function that would increment the Autoclick power, and then we need to attach the trigger to the Autoclick HTML element. Try writing it your own using the same pattern that we used for the click power button. But now let's implement it together. Let's start from the function. I call my function increase Autoclick power, and here we need to do the same steps. So the first step will be the validation. In this step, we need to check that the user has enough cookies and he can buy this upgrade. The second step is to update the JavaScript variables. And the last step is to update our HTML elements. So let's start from the validation. In the validation, I check that the count is more or equal to Autoclick cost. And if this condition is true, we subtract the Autoclick cost from the total count. And now we can update JavaScript variables. We do the changes only inside of this if statement because we don't want to update anything if the user doesn't have enough count. Here I increase the Autoclick power by 1, and now I need to set a new cost. So we want to increase the difficulty, and for that I will use a multiplier for the Autoclick cost. In the increase click power, we used the multiplier of 1.4, but I think that the difficulty of the Autoclick cost should be higher. And this is the reason why I will use the multiplier of 1.6. So here you can change the multiplier if you want to change the difficulty. Now we are ready to change the HTML elements. For all our variables, we have the responsible HTML element. It means that we need to change the corresponding HTML elements. So the first element is for the count. I assign a new text content, and this is the same update as we did in our increase click power. Then let's update the autoclick power. And here I need to be sure that this text that I add is the same as we used in our HTML. So let's check. And I see that in the HTML I have current autoclick power, then column, space, and 0. So here I use the same pattern, current autoclick power, column, space, and our dynamic variable. And the last element is autoclick cost. So now our function is done and we are ready to write our trigger. So again, we need to write our trigger because currently our button doesn't know what to do if we click it. And for our trigger, I will use add event listener as we did it before. So now we wrote our trigger and we can test how our function works. So my count is more than 50 and now I can upgrade my autoclick power. So we see that our UI elements have been updated and we see that our current autoclick power is 1, the previous was 0, and a new cost is 80. But as you see, it doesn't influence our game because we didn't write a function that will repeatedly click our cookie. After some interval, autoclick works in the way that after some interval, it clicks the cookie. So for example, our interval is 1 second. So after each second, it clicks the cookie. For that, in JavaScript, we have a function setInterval. I write the name setInterval and the first parameter is the function that we want to execute. If we look to the top of our file, you will see that after each click, we invoke the increase count, but increase count depends on the click power. We want to increase our count based on the autoclick power. And for that, we need to write a new function, increase count by autoclick. Let's write this function after increase autoclick power. So here I increase the count by autoclick. And then I update the HTML count element. And now we can provide this function to the setInterval. And the second parameter is the amount of milliseconds after which we want to execute our function. If we want to execute it after each second, we need to provide 1000 milliseconds. And to test how it works, we can add a new console log in our increase count by autoclick power button. So now if I inspect this page, in the console, you will see that we have the click message that appears in our console. So it means that from the beginning of our game, we execute this function once in a 1000 milliseconds, and this function adds the autoclick power to the count, but our autoclick power is 0, so the sum of our count remains the same, and this is the reason why we don't see any changes in our web. But if I earn enough cookies to buy this upgrade, now I see that our count starts to increment, and at the same time I can click as well. Now I have enough cookies to update our autoclick power, and now you see that we earn 2 cookies per second. My congratulations! Now you have built a working cookie clicker game with both upgrades and an autoclick feature. In the next video, you will learn about objects in JavaScript.